and I welcome very much Kenneth Aggerholm and Øyvind Standal, both from Oslo. Kenneth is professor of the Center of Pedagogy and Participation at the Norwegian School of Sports Science, and there in the program Body, Sport and Movement. And he is interested in Bildung, in sport philosophy, sport pedagogy, human science approaches, and practicing and development in sport. So, I will mention one publication, Practicing in Physical Education, a Phenomenological Grounded Study of Student Experiences, and this is together with Carl Emil Marstranda Askildsen. This is a PhD student from you. He graduated at Oslo last year with a very interesting work on physical education, practicing and Bildung. I would say like this. Yeah. So perhaps we can find something afterwards in your presentation as well. And Øyvind Standal, he is professor at the Department of Physical Education at the Norwegian School of Sport and Science. His research topics are teacher education, phenomenology, physical education, and teaching and learning. I will mention some articles. Exploring the embodied experiences of social relationships in physical education, together with Artur, and a chapter in Learning Movements, a phenomenological perspective of movement learning. So, together they publicated, I just mentioned it, on practicing and in physical education, outline for a pedagogical model in 2017. So, welcome, Kenneth. Welcome, Øyvind. So, we are curious.
Thank you, Malte. Building up expectations. It's already intimidating to speak after Fred Biesta, but I think it will connect nicely, not least since you mentioned physical education towards the end. So that's what we're going to talk about now. I'm presenting on behalf of Øyvind, as you said, and I also want to mention Carl Emil Askildsen, as he has contributed to the analysis that I'll present. So in this presentation, we'll invite Hannah Arendt into the gym, which might not be a perfect fit for her, but I don't think she would have to put out her cigarette and jump into activewear, which would not be comfortable for her, I expect. We imagine her sitting on the sideline or in the corner and smoking and observing and thinking about what she sees, what's going on in physical education, the school subject of physical education today. The presentation will be applied philosophy. We'll seek to apply Hannah Arendt's ideas to reimagine the school subject of physical education, and more specifically, we'll examine how foundational elements of Hannah Arendt's thinking can be relevant and open new possibilities for understanding the idea and the identity of physical education. So to do this, we'll begin by outlining two current crises in physical education to set the stage and introduce the relevance of taking Arendt into the gym. And we then draw on Arendt's analysis of vita activa and education to propose that these perspectives can inform new solutions to two current crises in physical education. And in the final part of the presentation, we'll outline how physical education might look like in light of Arendt's ideas. So we adopt a Bildung perspective to connect her ideas to pedagogical questions in physical education. And through this, we aim to contribute to a new philosophical understanding of the school subject. And we'll suggest that Arendt can inform a new idea of physical education as bodily Bildung. So, first, why is it relevant to invite Arendt into the gym? We'll point to two contemporary crises in the school subject of physical education that Arendt would have noticed from the bench on the side. The first crisis concerns the one-dimensionality of the subject's identity and content. This issue is well documented in research and describes how a narrow selection of movement cultures represented through sports and ball games continue to dominate. And drawing on Kirk's historical analysis of the subject's identity and practice, it could be argued that physical education faces an existential crisis. He identifies two distinct historical ideas of physical education, the first being physical education as gymnastics, which dominated until the 1950s, and the second, extending to the present, is physical education as sport techniques. And here the subject identity is tied to teaching of decontextualized sport techniques and motor skills within a multi-activity model where pupils are introduced to the same sports and activities repeatedly, but with no variation and no depth in learning. So Kirk contends that this approach is outdated and disconnected from the diversity of contemporary movement cultures outside the school, which also points to the second crisis that I'll return to shortly. According to Kirk, this idea of physical education is too narrow and unsustainable in the long run. So he emphasizes the necessity of a radical reform if the subject is to survive. And his suggestion involves either a proliferation where the subject comprises multiple ideas, for example, sport, exercise, active leisure, or a unification around a new idea of physical education as physical culture, incorporating diverse dimensions of physical culture. And I should mention that Joris Flier has presented a historical analysis of physical education that aligns with Kirk's, but he suggests a radically different solution, namely a return to Swedish gymnastics, arguing that an orientation towards movement culture and the introduction of educationally relevant sport is not the path to pursue. Instead, he suggests that Swedish gymnastics is educationally worthwhile because it's an activity concerned with the physical, the moving body. Others have argued for grounding the educational value of the subject in aesthetic values, hedonistic values, or the development of practical knowledge. And we'll use Arendt to feed into these debates and seek to offer a different solution, as we claim that there's a need for a multi-dimensional idea of physical education grounded in fundamental forms of activity. Before that, we'll examine the other crisis, which concerns detachment of physical education from the world. And this crisis pertains to a broader educational policy level, and we'll use the Norwegian curriculum as a case to illustrate a broader tendency across countries, at least in the western parts of the Western world. The educational policy developments in Norway leading to the current physical education curriculum effected in 2020 highlight the importance of preparing pupils for an unpredictable future. You probably recognize this argument, right? So this set clear educational policy directives emphasizing individual-based competencies and skills to equip each pupil for this uncertain future and to make them productive contributors in society. And it's been widely criticized for being influenced by neoliberal thinking, leading to increased goal setting, reporting, and shifts towards individualistic and performative understanding of competence, rather than emphasizing content and broader educational purposes. So it constructed an image of the economically desirable pupil, self-regulated individual with strong metacognitive skills, complete control over their learning. And this orientation towards individual competencies is also evident in the physical education curriculum implemented in 2020, where general Bildung is, for example, no longer part of the subject's purpose. Competence goals are formulated with the pupil as the acting subject, for example, exploring, planning, collaborating, performing, creating, executing, reflecting, understanding, while the status of the content has been reduced and it largely ignores the concrete movement cultures and traditions and activities. So the crisis lies in the subject's potential loss of connection to or failure to open the doors to the broader shared world of movement beyond the school. So the educational policy trends form the basis of what could be called a world-detached physical education. And it's against this background that we'll be drawing on Arendt's thoughts on education and propose a reorientation of the subject towards a shared world of movement. Our claim is that physical education should be more world-centered. And that, of course, is an ambition inspired by Fred Biesta's world-centered education and also Flee and Moisky's thing-centered pedagogy. But we'll draw primarily on Hannah Arendt. We'll seek to bring her in to rescue the school subject and point to new solutions or at least responses to the crisis. And we propose that her work on vita activa in the human condition can inform a multi-dimensional understanding of physical education as a contrast to the one-sided, one-dimensional understanding in current literature and practice. And we propose that her thoughts on education in between past and future, the essay "The Crisis in Education," can inform a world-centered understanding of physical education as a contrast to the individual-based competency orientation that detaches it from the world. So in the following, we'll briefly present her ideas before seeking to bring them together in our suggestion for a new understanding of physical education as bodily Bildung. First, analyzing the active life of vita activa in the human condition, Arendt describes three fundamental forms of human activity, which are labor, work, and action. Each corresponds to one of the basic conditions of human existence, which are life itself, worldliness, and plurality. Labor is rooted in the Greek term ponos and relates to the animal laborans performing the necessary tasks to sustain biological life. It belongs to the private sphere, it's subordinate to life itself, which could also be described as a natural world. And it encompasses repetitive bodily tasks that maintain life, such as eating, resting, exercising, cleaning, reproducing. And these activities are essential for regenerating and sustaining the body's biological processes. Secondly, work is rooted in the Greek term poiesis and describes the productive activity of bringing forth. It's the activity of Homo faber, the maker of durable and functional objects in the world, and it's grounded in human worldliness as it produces a man-made world of durability and permanence, following a clear beginning and end and operating within a means-ends logic. It's a work of the hands. It's directed towards an outcome in the form of tools, artifacts, creations, valued for their utility, reliability, and suitability. And finally, the third dimension or form of activity is action, which is rooted in the Greek term archein and refers to the expressive life where humans take initiative and interact as acting and speaking beings. It concerns the intangible interest or in-between that connects people in a web of relationships, and is grounded in the condition of plurality, describing how individuals reveal their identities and participate in a shared diverse world through engagement, initiatives, and spontaneous acts. It represents a freedom that becomes manifest in the collective and has its end in itself. It's autotelic. So through unique expressions and interactions with others, we tell life stories and reveal who we are, not merely what we are. And it belongs to the public sphere and is sustained by trust and forgiveness in human relationships. So together these forms of activity can describe fundamental dimensions of human existence, where labor sustains life and the natural world, and work shapes the world, and action sustains a shared human world. So navigating by these forms of activity in physical education can, we will argue and show in a couple of slides, contribute to a multi-dimensional understanding of physical education. But before that, we'll present Arendt's ideas of education and to introduce this. I think it's worth noticing the role of amor mundi, love of the world, in Arendt's work. In the preface of an anthology with this title, Bernauer noted that writing to Karl Jaspers in 1955, Arendt spoke of how she had only just begun to really love the world and expressed her desire to testify to that love in the title of what came to be published as The Human Condition. Out of gratitude, I want to call my book about political theories Amor Mundi. In retrospect, it was fitting that Amor Mundi, Love of the World, never became the title of the only one of Arendt's studies, for it's a theme that permeates all of her thought. So this love of the world is important for understanding the work of Arendt, according to Bernauer, and I think perhaps it's most explicit in her short essay on education. In this essay, published shortly after The Human Condition, she describes the essence of any educational activity as rooted in two principles. First, natality, the fact that humans are born into an existing world, and second, conservation, the desire to preserve a shared world. The crisis in education arises when teachers no longer take a stand for or love or assume responsibility for a shared world. Teaching then loses its fundamental orientation towards the world and becomes focused instead on the pupils themselves. And as we illustrated in the second crisis described earlier, this appears to be an acute issue for physical education. But the problem is not new, and following Arendt, we can trace its origins to broader philosophical and pedagogical shifts. And first, she describes how the Cartesian dualism in Western philosophy has fostered an inward turn, subjectivism and estrangement from the world. So humanity has, in her analysis, fled from its being in the world into the self. And secondly, she links the crisis to the dominance of progressive education in the mid-20th century, which begins with the premise that children have their own world and that teachers are to encourage children to govern their own world rather than teach a content or point with love to the world. So this, Arendt argues, leaves the children at the mercy of the group and robs them of the opportunity to rebel against or stand up against or meet the established order of the world. So together these tendencies result in children being excluded from a shared world and confined to their own world. And it's in contrast with this that she argues that the pedagogical task is to introduce young people into a shared world. The teacher's qualification consists in knowing the world and being able to instruct others about it. But his authority rests on his assumption of responsibility for that world. Vis-à-vis the child, it is as though he were representative. I'm sorry, it's a bit small here. Maybe it's better up here. Representative of, vis-à-vis the child is as though he were representative of all adult inhabitants, pointing out the details and saying to the child, this is our world. So the qualification, authority and responsibility of a teacher is fundamentally anchored in the knowledge of and assumption of responsibility for the world. And for Arendt, this task and education in general fundamentally hinges on a love for the world and for the children. That's stated in the other quote on the right. Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and education too is where we decide whether we love our children enough to not expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, nor to strike from their hands the chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world. And I put some pictures in of my son, who a couple of years ago had a new teacher, and suddenly he became a Kiss fan, and he started playing the guitar, and he became a Nottingham Forest fan. So that was, and I was working on Arendt at that time, and I was kind of, wow, this new teacher opened a new world for my son, right? So he just embraced it and went all in. And I'm not saying that Kiss and Nottingham Forest is best this world has produced, but it's a good example of how you affect children when you point to the world and show the world with love. Okay, so to summarize, the conservational task of education is essential for Arendt, but it shouldn't be misconstrued as an attempt to fit the children into a fixed understanding of the world. On the contrary, the pedagogical conservatism is precisely a way to enable what is new and revolutionary in every child. So that's an important dialectic that teachers must mediate between. The children's freedom must have a foundation. A novelty can only be new when it's introduced into an old world with traditions and established understandings. So children must learn about this shared world that exists before they can bring something new into it, reject it or rebel against it. So it's for this reason that education, in her account of it, must fundamentally be world-centered. So, how can this contribute to our understanding of physical education? And of course, taking Arendt's ideas into physical education requires some interpretation of her philosophical and educational ideas. And first, regarding life as a fundamental condition and labor's role in sustaining it, Arendt didn't emphasize this dimension in her analysis of education. To her, it belonged to the private sphere or the household. But I think since this school subject concerns the body, the physical body, and the biological body, we contend that unlike many other school subjects, it must encompass the natural conditions of human existence. Which involves teaching children how to take care of the processes in their biological bodies and the natural world in general. Also, Arendt's analysis of work highlights its contribution to forming and shaping a shared world, and since we consider movement as the primary element that pupils in physical education bring forth, we propose that the condition of worldliness in Arendt can be interpreted to involve the pupil's creation and practicing of movement. And finally, we interpret that what Arendt describes as the web of human relationships formed through action that connects people and creates a shared world can be interpreted as engagement in a shared body culture. And we base this on a note she makes in The Crisis in Culture, where she outlines or describes an understanding of culture as care for the worldly objects and works created by humans, preserving them rather than consuming or using them up. So technically, culture is kind of in between work and action. But she emphasizes the role of action in sustaining the shared world where culture can emerge and be preserved. So we find it consistent with her analysis to link action to body culture in our interpretation. So building on these dimensions, we propose that they collectively support a trialectical understanding of bodily Bildung in physical education. So it's aligned with Hannah Arendt's relational understanding of human existence in Vita Activa, as Bildung describes as active self-formation in a reciprocal and interplay with between oneself, others, and the world. It emphasizes the role of responsiveness, negativity, responsibility in the Bildung process, in contrast to seeing education as this linear progression towards learning goals and competencies. So, although Arendt didn't explicitly discuss Bildung in her writings, her work resonates with and arguably belongs to the continental tradition of Bildung. That's claimed by Thomas Römer. So we find it justified to use her work to propose a new, renewed orientation of physical education towards Bildung. And doing so also requires an embodied account of Bildung, which marks a shift from the idealist tradition where Bildung originated. And this shift is seen in recent arguments for embodied accounts of Bildung by Brinkmann, Tøstig, Norwegian colleagues, Dyngland and Ingersrud, among others. So we've taken inspiration from these, and we also think that these three dimensions in Arendt's thinking can expand the bodily accounts of Bildung and inform a trialectical conception of body Bildung that concurrently encompasses both the physical, the lived, and the sociocultural body. And especially the inclusion of care for the physical and biological body in the account of Bildung, we believe, is an expansion of the other accounts. So we'll argue that this trialectical understanding of bodily Bildung, informed by Arendt's accounts of the human condition, can be particularly relevant for a multi-dimensional and world-centered idea of physical education. And that's what we've sought to illustrate in this figure. It shows the foundational dimensions of physical education as bodily Bildung. So physical education on this account should be oriented at first, life, or the natural world, which concerns Bildung oriented at health. Here the biological and physical body is at the center. The general purpose of this dimension is to provide pupils with experiences with physical activity, exercise, fostering knowledge about the body's natural processes, and nurture care for the physical body, and the natural world that the bodies are embedded in. Teaching about life and health can draw on knowledge about exercise, training principles, and draw on health and life sciences. The second dimension of worldliness concerns Bildung oriented at movement, and this dimension focuses on the body's work and techniques, emphasizing the creation and practicing of movements as a central pedagogical task. The general purpose of this dimension is to provide pupils with experience of crafting, creating, refining ways of moving, enabling them to gain knowledge about the body's work and how they can alter their capabilities in specific movements. That constitutes a bodily knowledge that can expand the pupils' movement horizons and offer new opportunities for participation in physical activities and could contribute to shaping a shared world of movement. Teaching can be inspired by traditional apprenticeship models where a master provides guidance to imitating movements, or teachers can draw on motor learning or accounts of practicing to develop and refine ways of moving. And the third dimension is plurality, which concerns Bildung oriented at body culture. And this dimension emphasizes bodily relationships and interaction, where pupils can explore engagement with a plurality of body culture, with different norms and values and from different historical and cultural contexts. The general purpose of pedagogical work in this dimension is for pupils to experience expressing themselves with others and gain an understanding of who they are as acting and embodied subjects. And through action, pupils are equipped to engage in and contribute to sustaining and renewing a shared world of movement. And teaching is here can be understood as an initiation into cultural practices, focusing on elements like expression and identity, community values, and the ethos of practices. And as this figure also illustrates, the dimensions are not they are distinct, but they are also overlapping. So they represent activity forms that can orient teaching of various activities. And for example, if you teach parkour in physical education, you can focus your teaching on strength, endurance, flexibility to avoid injury, focusing on life and health, the biological body. You can also focus on skills and tricks that are part of doing parkour, focusing more on the worldliness, and you can focus on parkour as part of a subculture that is resisting modernity and ways of moving in the city, so this critical cultural movement, or you can focus on parkour as a performance movement, and parkour is sportified, so you can focus on competition and sportification of parkour. And they can be combined in various ways. That's what we're trying to express with these overlaps in the figure. So the important thing is to focus on activity forms rather than activities to ensure this multi-dimensional approach in physical education. So to summarize and conclude, we've sought to take Hannah Arendt into the gym and use her ideas to suggest a new philosophical foundation for physical education. And we've argued that her three fundamental forms of human activity, labor, work, and action, can provide a trialectical framework for understanding bodily Bildung in physical education. It grounds the subject in the human condition, which can offer a robust understanding of the subject's identity as an alternative to values or a certain essence or physical culture. And it can contribute to a coherent and multi-dimensional conception of physical education by orienting it towards a healthy life, the worldliness of movement, and the plurality of body culture. And we hope that this philosophical account of physical education can provide a conceptual basis for future curriculum development and for teacher education, hopefully also other areas, but we envision that it would be relevant for those areas especially. And regarding curriculum development, we envision that this idea of physical education can counter the dominant competency-oriented approaches and neoliberal ideologies, opening a way for a more world-centered approach where pupils are introduced to the existing world of activity and movement. And regarding teacher education, we hope that taking these ideas into teacher education can remind future teachers of their task to show the pupils this shared world with love and assume responsibility for it. Thank you for your attention.